I guess really the first question is, what is the rationale for your campaign?
Well, you know, I'm a combat veteran and a working mom, and those two things work together to, lead me to want to fulfill the oath that I took to support and defend the Constitution, but also protect the country that I love, that my kids are growing up into.
And so what are your big issues?
Yeah, the biggest issues are probably access to affordable quality health care for everybody. As you know, Texas has a pretty bad record when it comes to maternal mortality. We've got the highest number of children in the country that have no access to insurance. So protecting the millions of Texans that have pre-existing conditions. I've had a couple of very complicated pregnancies. In my first pregnancy, I was facing getting laid off by my healthcare job. Actually, I was working in healthcare for 5 years. And that was terrifying. And we really just need to take better care of people, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because, 80% of the people who walk into a military recruiting station, for example, are unfit for duty, either because of an educational reason or a healthcare reason. And this isn't something we can afford to do to the next generation of Americans if we're going to maintain our status as a global superpower.
Do you have any other top issues? That sounds like your number one issue.
Yeah, I mean, they're really all connected. So healthcare and national security, I actually think are connected. Climate change is important. The refugee crisis that climate change causes through natural disasters around the world presents a national security threat to our country and our allies. So these things are really all connected. I would definitely say, though, that access to quality, affordable health care and national security, including border security, are my top priorities.
As it relates to health care, do you support Medicare for all?
I support access to Medicare. I support a buy-in option. I've heard several great plans that haven't even, been able to get a vote because of the toxicity and the hyper-partisanship and the dysfunction of DC. When I was pregnant and facing getting laid off, it would have been great if I could have used that, pre-existing condition and gone and, bought into Medicare to make sure that I still had quality coverage.
And so when you're talking about access to the buy-in, you're under the plan you support so that people can still maintain their private health insurance.
Yeah, I mean, I always come back to my values. My values are things like human dignity, freedom, and we have to have the freedom to be able to execute whatever options we want. Patient empowerment is important to me through the 5 years that I spent in healthcare. So if people want to stay on their private insurance, I think they should have that option. A lot of employers use it as a hiring benefit,
And because there is a plan in Congress right now that many Democrats do support, which is Medicare for all, but no private insurance remains at all.
Yeah, I don't support that. I, have been the recipient of several different models under the military, and I understand that there are well-intended models that have the unintended consequences of removing empowerment to patients and have the possibility of lowering quality. And I just want to make sure that whatever plan I support is going to put at the forefront incentivizing quality and innovation, empowering patients, and having access, especially in rural areas. Getting out broadband to rural areas is a healthcare issue with telemedicine and the future of the way that we deliver care. That ties healthcare to infrastructure. It's just another example of how these things are all not in a silo, but all connected.
Regarding infrastructure, do you support efforts by the administration and some in Congress to have a massive massive infrastructure bill?
I do support. I think that we are decades behind where we need to be as a country, even in things like cybersecurity. But infrastructure absolutely has to be a priority. And the infrastructure was in the news recently, highlighting the toxicity in D.C., though, and the inability of parties to work together. And, I often say that when people say they don't like the two-party system, it's not the system they don't like. It's the toxic, hyper-partisanship in the way that people can't work together.
So what guarantees can you assure Texans that you can work across the aisle with Republicans?
Well, I think you should be nervous anytime somebody guarantees you anything. But I can tell you that I was raised in rural Texas. I was raised as a Republican in a very Republican family. I served 12 years in the military, which at that time, a little bit less so now, but was a very Republican kind of infrastructure. Went out into the world and experienced other cultures and other countries and other people and other ideas and became a Democrat. I don't I don't really ascribe to this partisan bickering and the my side, your side, look to my party leadership to find out how to vote. I look for other servant leaders within my party and with across the aisle, and I'm absolutely committed to serving the people of Texas and the people of America, and not the ambitions of a handful of people.
You came pretty close to winning your congressional race back last year, 2018. And so I'm wondering, how is that going to be easier winning a statewide race?
Well, first of all, the partisan index in my congressional district was much heavier Republican than it was statewide. But I really think that if you're asking how we're going to win, the answer is people are fired up. Close races increase voter turnout. The more people who show up to the polls, the better that is for me. The more that people in Texas realize that their voice matters, that somebody's listening to them, that their vote counts. We're going to be making this campaign hyper-local and make sure that we're talking to people about the issues that are important to them, and that I'm fighting for the solutions that come out of the communities that I'm representing, instead of me telling them that I have all the answers or repeating party line talking points. I'm really a big believer in collaborating and working with people and bringing their voices to D.C.
Is there a risk, though, that people may take it as you don't have the solutions? Because part of running for office is to have solutions, right?
I have solutions, but I'm also not the narcissist to think that I'm always right about everything. And I think that we need to absolutely continue to seek out leaders who are able to collaborate and are able to think outside the box and be solution-oriented. So I certainly have ideas on all of the major issues of the day, but I also will continue a commitment to working with the communities that I'm representing.
Before you get to run against John Cornyn, and he's got to go through a primary, you've got to go through a primary. And so there are a number of other Democrats who have either expressed an interest, said they're going to run, considering a run. And so I'm wondering how you've got to get through a primary. And so how do you win that?
Well, I went through a primary in my congressional district. I went through a runoff in my congressional district. I think that the primary system can sometimes be toxic if it is a race to extremes, and then we end up having a government of people who can't work together. However, the people that I've heard talked about entering the primary, and we'll just have to see who enters, I don't think that that's going to be the case. I think we're going to be working together and collaborating and being primary partners, and just trying to figure out which one of us is going to represent the greatest possible challenge to John Cornyn, who is clearly not representing the interests of Texas. He's representing the interests of his, donors and his corporate PACs and the pharmaceutical industry and things like that. We're all marching toward the same goal. We're all rowing in the same direction. And I've been a Texan since I was 7, and in a generation we haven't had these really great competitive primaries and a lot of great candidates to offer the voters of Texas. So frankly, I'm just excited that we're in an age where we have such a rich field of people who are willing to serve.
When we spoke with Senator Cornyn recently, and you see it on his social media accounts as well, he ties you in. He says that you are Chuck Schumer's hand-picked candidate, and that you're very close to Hollywood. How do you respond to that?
I think it's interesting that he talks about me so much, and I think that the only thing that I am handpicked for is by his team as the candidate he doesn't want to face in the general.
Why is that, do you think?
Because he's paying me a lot of attention for a challenger who hasn't even been through a primary yet. I think that it's been very encouraging to me and my team and our chances of taking him down that he is so concerned with me and my race.
Why do you think he's vulnerable?
He's incredibly vulnerable because the people of Texas, more than partisan lines and more than party loyalty, the people of Texas want to see a fighter. They want to see somebody take on the establishment like I did when I was in the military. And I did it in a respectful way that, benefited military effectiveness instead of just, a disdain for authority. But they want somebody who's going to not be intimidated and not, look to somebody else to get their marching orders. They want integrity, servant leadership. And I think that he sees the same data that I see, and he understands that Texans are ready for a working mom who is somebody who's just like them and a patriot who has served their country. to represent their values.
You had said something before. Give me an example of how you fought the establishment in the military.
So when I was a combat rescue pilot, I was medevacing a lot of women off the battlefield. And when in my third tour, I was shot down and had to engage the enemy in ground combat. I got shrapnel wounds that I've covered with tattoos. And that put me in a position of credibility to be able to challenge a policy that was intended to keep women out of combat. But all it resulted in was tying the hands of the commanders in the field and having to attach women to units instead of assign them. It's pretty complex, but it was leading to a toxic culture in the military and just really not good for recruiting and retention. There was a million reasons why it was bad for the military, which is why the Joint Chiefs agreed with me and unanimously asked the Secretary of Defense to repeal the policy. But I learned a really valuable lesson about civil liberties that day, and that is that you can't just feel like you've won a civil liberty and then focus on something else, because the next day, the senator from Alabama at the time, Jeff Sessions, said he was going to legislate the policy back in place. So that became the real fight, was going to D.C., making sure that legislation didn't pass because Jeff Sessions didn't know what was best for the military more so than the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs. And I learned a lot about how DC worked. I got asked, are you on our donor list? What can you do for my boss? What kind of political capital can you offer? And I was like, wow, this is not in the Constitution that I just bled for. So I'm going to have to come back here with a little bit more authority and a title that's going to allow me to fire some of these people and get rid of some of this corruption.
I wanted to ask you, as far as you talked a little bit about the environment, and I'm wondering the Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. Where are you on that?
I support the intention of having aggressive climate change action. I think that it's unfortunate anytime we are trying to attack a really important issue that affects so many lives, and then a lot of kind of social issues get attached to that. I think that that's unfortunate. So I probably would not have voted for it for that reason. But climate change, both from my kids' future, I'd like my kids to be able to live in a healthy country, in a healthy world, be able to drink the water and breathe the air, and not be facing an existential crisis, and not be facing, humanitarian crises around the world from, natural disasters. So I do think that we need to be more aggressive to fight climate change.
But the idea is attached to the Green New Deal. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
no air travel, or just,
Exactly.
cows. You think that's unworkable?
I think that we need to be pragmatic, but that's not a code word for timid. I think that we can be aggressive and we can pursue solutions without being timid, but while being realistic and pragmatic.
Some conservative critics say that what the advocates for that are saying is really degrowth. Getting away from what has propelled the economy. People say that the United States, after all these decades, is finally energy independent, and the critics say this would take away from that. We would go back to how we were before. What do you say to that?
I think that investment in renewable energy is really the only way to be truly energy independent. I think that there's a lot of potential for growth in the renewable energy sector, and I would disagree that those people understand what propelled us to a position of economic strength in our position as a global superpower. What propelled us to that strength was the American dream and the entrepreneurial spirit. And right now, the thing that prevents people from going back to school and getting more education to solve some of these problems, or to open their own business, or to create the technology that we need to depend on to truly be energy independent, because if we were energy independent, we wouldn't be so involved in so many crises in the Middle East. We need to be able to have people not dependent on their employer supplied health care. We need people to have an option to buy into Medicare to really spur on that entrepreneurship, which is the backbone of America.
Have to ask you about border security. Where are you on that issue as far as what's going on at the border right now with all these people coming through? The White House said, they had on Wednesday 1,000 people at one time coming through the El Paso sector. So what do you make of what's going on at the border, and what's your solution to fix it?
Well, I think that one of the things that makes me sleep better at night is to see how many more veteran candidates we have running for office, because I think that you can't do 3 tours in Afghanistan in a war-torn country and not have national security as one of your top priorities. We need people who are making these decisions and putting forth solutions to be working in the communities that we're talking about, understanding them and working with them to come up with solutions. But while we can provide a response to these crises in a way that does prioritize our national security without taking away people's dignity and violating their human rights. I think that we need to be more root cause oriented. We need to talk a little bit about strategic use of military forces, but also strategic use of humanitarian assistance. A lot of people see humanitarian assistance as some bleeding heart thing, and they don't understand the strategic importance of it, the leverage that it gives us, the ability to stop things before they get to our borders.
So you're talking about the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, is that right? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think that we need to use strategic use of humanitarian assistance, trade partnerships, all of these things work together. We need to use all of the tools at our disposal with our important relationships with our allies, with our critical dynamics that we have with people who are not our allies. I see a lot of that as a problem national security-wise globally. The way that we are going to address border security effectively is going to be through technology and through investing in people. Giving the agencies that are charged with keeping our border secure the resources that they need. I was a member of the Counter-Drug Task Force as a pilot for 3 years, and I know that the things that we are trying to stop from coming into our country are not the asylum seekers, and that those things that we're trying to stop from coming in are also coming in through the air and the water, and a wall that is going to result in stealing land from Texas landowners and cattle ranchers and stealing the military construction budget from the sorely needed construction that we need of daycares and helping our lodging facilities that we have soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines living in pest-riddled, moldy places.
So you oppose the border wall being expanded?
I do oppose using military construction money. I oppose the construction of a border wall, but I definitely oppose using that money and stealing land and giving it to the government from Texans, yes.
And so what about the existing wall? Do you support that? Or do you support tearing that down, or where are you on the existing wall?
Well, all summer I have a travel plan of being in Hidalgo and El Paso County and working with local leaders. And I'm not going to make unilateral, talking point stump speeches about ideological objections to a wall just because it represents something that the current administration is doing and that's my party. When I go and I talk to people in those communities and I talk to the local leaders, if there's something about the current construction that helps them, then perhaps I can be persuaded to support it. But I haven't had those conversations yet.
Is there a possibility that you would, after having these discussions, that you would say, I don't favor, I think we should take down this wall, the wall that's up?
Through my extensive experience in, working with, a multitude of countries in, security, working alongside people from all sorts of cultures and going and traveling the world and seeing the things that work and the things that do not work, I am not convinced I will ever be persuaded to support a border wall. I have not seen a physical barrier be as effective as investment in technology, in information technology, in cybersecurity, and in the people who are charged with keeping our nation safe.
Wanted to get 2 more questions in, if I could, real quick, and that was just on tariffs and trade. Mm-hmm. We're seeing, the president's policy proposal on that, as far as instituting tariffs on Mexican goods, if something isn't done by June 10th.
Right.
Where are you on that and on this new United States-Canada-Mexico agreement?
I think that one of the things that concerns me is the willingness to tweet out policy, whether that's a transgender ban in the military or tariffs or things like that. It seems to me like actions are being taken that are not well thought out and in partnership with industry experts and the people, talking to the people who it's going to impact. I think a lot of it is political theater and rhetoric, and it's breaking down, the important relationships that we have with our allies. It disturbs me to see a lot of the criticisms of Canada when I fought and bled next to and medevaced out men and women that had, blood on the Canadian flag of their uniform in Afghanistan. We can't forget who our allies are, and we need to treat them with respect. We should be a country in the world that people want to be an ally to. And we should represent a country in the world that people fear opposing us and trying to oppress us and trying to attack our values.
Wanted to ask you about impeachment. I know a number of Democratic presidential candidates, a number of Democrats in the House want to see impeachment proceedings begin against the president. Where are you on that?
I think it's important that we have three co-equal branches of government that provide checks and balances, and I think that Congress has a responsibility to exercise that oversight. I do see value in letting the American people at the ballot box make that decision, but frankly, I'm a little bit concerned that the Miller report and all of that the news comes out of that is impeachment. The big news that's being buried, I think, is election security. The fact that we are clearly under attack by a foreign power who now there's, signs of them testing nukes and things like that, and why this isn't a bigger concern for more people. I share Bob Mueller's, concern that is the thing that we should be focusing on. So
if I hear you correctly, you don't really support the idea of impeachment against the president.
I'm not going to go so far as to say that I don't, because I do think that impeachment proceedings do give one of the branches of government a tool to investigate. And we have an obligation to future generations to set a precedent for what behavior we're going to tolerate and that we think is acceptable in our elected leaders. As far as timing and, the country is just so divided and there are so many people who feel like, the argument between the left and right is so much more important than the clear threat that we are being, faced by from Russia and even from China and trade. And, so I guess at this point, I don't know how I would vote. I guess I would need to see the rest of the evidence. I mean, I haven't talked to the leaders who are calling for impeachment. I haven't talked to the leaders who are saying we shouldn't impeach. Right now, I think that we should be focused on unity and identifying the fact that the real enemies are outside of our country, not across the aisle.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.